Catherine, it's interesting. We're in a city here with millions. It's such a vibrant city, and yet you go to communities where there's about 50 people. But somehow you figured out a way to try and link the two. Talk to us about that.
Well, I was mentioning that one of the main problems we have in, I guess in universities, but in many work and many way of life in our countries is taking airplanes. There's not much we can do about taking airplanes because we travel, and that emits a lot of carbon dioxide. So the people in communities in Panama have actually offered McGill University to offset their flights. So we're trying to develop this notion of Fairtrade carbon. So professors and students from the university can register their flights. We can calculate easily how much emission that represents and convert that into trees. And so for every airplane flight that people want to offset, we're going to plant trees in those communities where I work with in Panama, which is kind of cool because it's kind of bringing indigenous people of Panama, helping us here with our sustainable or unsustainable way of life.
And it helps the people here recognize just how much the cost is every time they jump in a plane.
Indeed, because if we talk about fair trade carbon, it's not that we're going to go with the cheapest offset. We want to ensure that the people have the right livelihoods, the right income, so that this is really a development for them. So indeed, it's going to be, I think, a quite nice win-win situation.
And an eye-opener.
And an eye-opener, yes, indeed.
In 2009, the United Nations Convention on Climate Change met in Copenhagen with leaders from 120 countries. Hopes were high for setting emission targets and other goals for each country. Let's start with Copenhagen. What was that like, being there and that experience? Tell us what capacity you were there in and what the experience was like.
Yeah, Copenhagen, for many of us, so I was in Copenhagen as a negotiator on behalf of Panama, a small country in Central America, because one of the important items that was negotiated was the role of forest in regulating climate. And I'm a biologist, I'm a specialist of the tropical forest. So my link to the bigger agenda of climate change is through the forests. So what you need to understand is Copenhagen was the endpoint of work over a 4-year period. There was the first conference that launched the negotiation process that really failed in Copenhagen was in 2005. The countries of the world met in Montreal, actually, and began to look for a new deal, a new climate deal that would involve all the countries of the world. Very much at the time, the question was, why should the, quote, developed country, the US, Europe, Canada, do something if countries like China, India, Brazil do not have targets to reduce their emission? So basically the developed country were saying, we don't want to do anything about climate until those big developing countries also need to do. And so for 4 years before Copenhagen, delegates from all these countries tried to find a common language and a way forward, which was a miserable failure for a number of reasons in Copenhagen. So I think it was devastating. I know several negotiators went on a nervous breakdown after that. There was so much hope, and hope that just disappeared under our finger.
It's 10 years since Copenhagen now. We're looking at a decade.
A decade.
Your spirits, what were they like going into the actual conference in 2009, and what were your spirits like when it was over?
So when we went into Copenhagen, I think there was a lot of hope because we had worked extremely hard, and I think we had advanced on ways to find solutions. And of course, it was devastating to see the failure. The way I lived it, of course, I lived it from inside. I didn't live it, from the outside. But it seemed that the failure of Copenhagen, to me anyway, was a series of mistakes in the negotiation. It was, first of all, a desire to not listen to everybody. So in the UN is the place where all the countries of the world have one voice. That's their strength and that's the weakness, because of course, when there's all the country has one voice, it can be very noisy. But then if you have an agreement, that agreement is very strong. And when we arrived in Copenhagen to negotiate, the feeling immediately was, the conference will speak with just a few of the important countries and put aside other countries. And so that cleavage, that division between those countries worthy of being spoken to and the country we pushed out was really what made that conference fail. Because, of course, you cannot try to have an international agreement with all the countries in the world by pushing some country aside. You do have to take into account all the circumstances of every single country and then advance together on a solution.
The world got another chance to draft a plan on climate change in 2015, this time in Paris. 186 nations submitted their plans to curb emissions and limit global temperatures to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. But the reality is, even with these plans, the planet is on track to exceed the limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels by the end of the century. What's more, the United States, one of the world's biggest polluters, pulled out of the Paris Agreement in 2017.
When you look at Paris, one of the things that I found interesting about it is you saw the U.S. president at the time, Barack Obama, and President Xi Jinping really trying to drive this and trying to get the world going in the right direction. And then we have what some would say is success, and then you have the U.S. president backing away from the Paris Agreement, President Trump. Again, the ups and downs. Give me your sense about the Paris deal and what happened following.
So I think the Paris Agreement was a real success, and they've really learned from Copenhagen. And what I found extremely intelligent and astute from the Paris, the French delegation that was managing that conference, is they gave full responsibilities to countries who were not so happy. For example, Bolivia was charged with overseeing forests. And Bolivia had a very strong opinion on forest, but they became a central actor to get an agreement. And so basically, instead of trying to muzzle them, they empowered them, and by empowering them, they looked for this decision. And clearly, the agreement of Barack Obama with China ahead of the Paris conference, with agreement on what those two countries would do together, was fundamental, because you had the two biggest emitters in the world, together looking at what you want to do. So yes, now the US have left the Paris Agreement, but the Paris Agreement is still there. And so in my mind, the US are isolating themselves, and the world is still going in that direction. And we're seeing it more and more. We see the young people of the world that are raising and saying, come on, stop this nonsense. You need to act. It's our future that you're playing. So I think it's harmful to the US currently to not be part.
While some countries, the United States comes to mind, you have a presidential candidate, the current president who ran saying, I'm going to bring back the coal jobs and fossil fuels. And yet you have, I believe it's Ecuador that has it in their constitution, Mother Earth. It must be fascinating to look at how some countries address this, see it as a serious issue, while others perhaps do not.
I think there's several countries that are extremely committed to advance. in general, we would say that all those small island states, Fiji, for example, very small islands that see the sea level rising and they find their schools now underwater and so on. So they're really scared and they are the watchdog of climate. They're trying to catalyze action towards changing climate. Europe in general has been a very good citizen. Europe has been a group of countries that have kind of taken their responsibility and moved forward towards new economies. In Latin America, a number of countries, very progressive, and I would think this is largely the imprint of indigenous thoughts. You mentioned Ecuador with their constitution. Bolivia has done the same kind of changes to their constitution that now acknowledge the rights of Mother Earth. This is really the spirit of indigenous people that recognize our organic link between people and nature. And then you have countries that tend to be very reluctant to change: Canada, the US, Australia, Japan, countries that have invested their infrastructure in a certain ways, countries of cars, of big highways, countries that don't see or don't want to engage in the necessary reorganization.
Reorganization would mean far less reliance on fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, and much more on renewable sources like wind, solar, and hydropower. Some countries have already committed themselves to green energy. After the 2011 nuclear plant disaster in Fukushima, Japan, Chancellor Angela Merkel announced Germany would phase out nuclear power and transition to 100% renewable energy by 2050. Costa Rica already gets 98% of its electricity from a mix of hydropower, biomass, geothermal, wind, and solar. And China, although the world's biggest polluter, is also the biggest investor in renewable energy. Renewable sources make up nearly 40% of China's power source.
There's a new economy that is emerging. It's a low-carbon economy. And in any economic school, you would learn that the first people that move on something new are going to be the one that have the more opportunity to be the winner, right? Because they are the innovators. Those countries that have vested interest and stranded assets in high carbon, they're going to suffer, I think, in 10 to 20 years because they will see they've missed a turn where they should have modernized.
You say it's emerging. Is this economy emerging quickly enough, though?
So, of course, as a climate expert, I would say, no, it's not emerging fast enough. But it is emerging fast. When I was hired at McGill in the early 1980s, in my job interview, I clearly remember somebody saying, "You're working on climate what?" And that was a colleague, that was a biologist. That's how little we knew about climate change. And now every citizen in every country of the world know about climate change. So the awareness has, increased a lot, and we're making gains everywhere. So we're already not on the most apocalyptic climate scenario. We're somewhat better than that. We still have to do a lot, but we're doing something. It doesn't help people to feel helpless, I think. So I'm still optimistic that when push comes to shove, people will react and we will be able to curb the most of the effect.
Glass half full.
Yeah.
Catherine is optimistic and also outspoken. She launched a project called Sustainable Canada Dialogue, bringing together 80 researchers to make recommendations on what Canada can do about climate change.
What are some of the ideas that get percolated up and recommendations that you come up with?
So when we came up together in 2014-15 for the first time, we actually proposed a climate plan for Canada based on 10 different actions, but I can summarize them, I think, in 3 main axes of action. So the first one is there needs to be a price on carbon. So there's a problem with the economy, and in the US, California has a price of carbon. That's the one thing to do. This is a molecule that is causing harm, and it's like a tax over cigarette that would help then pay the health care of people that smoke. So it's the same kind of polluter pay, very common economic tool. Then you need to have clean electricity. So you need to produce electricity with sun, wind, and hydro in order to give people the energy they need, but that is not producing carbon dioxide. And the third one is you need to start to develop ways to get people off fossil fuel by facilitating, in particular, transportation. So you need more public transportation, more active transportation, other pleasant way of moving around than with one truck that emits carbon dioxide. So car sharing, bike sharing, a cocktail of different options. If it's easier for people to not take their car, then it's going to be easier to transition away from cars. So you need to work on the demand side, not just the supply. The supply is the clean electricity. The demand is the moving, the heating your house. So what you want is to make that demand side easier.
And for those watching who are saying to themselves, I think it's fascinating what you're doing, I think it's great what you're doing, this is obviously a pressing issue, what can I do? What would you say to them?
So for me, it's very simple. And maybe you will not like the answer. There really are 2 main emission sources on which we have a control. One is, how do we move on the landscape? How do you go to work every day? If you take a car, you're emitting a lot more than if you bike, or if you take a bus, or if you walk. So moving on the landscape is the first thing you need to see. Okay, so try to not take a car, okay? Cars should go away, unless they are electric car in a low carbon, electricity grid like Quebec, for example. And then the second that people don't like even less than that is, what do you do on holiday? Are you taking a plane to go on holiday? Well, you should not. There's a paper that came out very recently that said that the one thing you could do to lower your footprint is cut 1 international airplane traveling per year. That's the one most important thing you can do. So if your lifestyle is about popping all around the world in airplanes, either reduce that or offset them by planting trees in the tropics. They grow faster. So my husband and we've decided we don't travel anymore in airplane for holidays. And I don't travel anymore for work, except to go to Panama, because that's something I cannot cut. So I think it's a bit like, Weight Watchers. And the 2 things you have to watch for is airplanes and cars.
Climate watchers in this case.
Climate watchers, yes, indeed.
What a delight. Thanks so much for talking to us.
Pleasure.